What do you get when you cross a war hero with a child killer? Meet Gilles de Rais, the man who stood beside Joan of Arc as she crowned a king, then spent the next decade systematically torturing and murdering children in his castle dungeons. We're talking about a guy who went from national hero to history's most notorious serial killer in less than 20 years. This isn't some Hollywood fiction. This is the real story of how medieval France's golden boy became its darkest nightmare. A tale so twisted that even today, historians debate whether he was a monster or just the victim of the ultimate medieval setup. By the end of this video, you'll understand how power, isolation, and unchecked desire can turn a saint into Satan himself. And trust me, the truth is far more disturbing than any horror movie could ever be. Born in 1405, Gilles de Rais had everything handed to him on a silver platter. His family owned massive estates across Brittany and Anjou, making him one of the wealthiest men in France before he even hit puberty. When his parents died, young Gilles inherited a fortune that would make modern billionaires jealous. But here's the thing, wealth wasn't enough for this kid. He wanted glory. At just 16, Gilles threw himself into the 100 Years' War with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never seen a real battlefield. And damn, was he good at it. The guy had a natural talent for warfare that caught everyone's attention, especially when he started racking up victories against the English. Then came 1429, the year that changed everything. A peasant girl named Joan of Arc showed up claiming God told her to crown the Dauphin as king. Most nobles laughed her off, not Gilles. He saw something in her, something that convinced him to throw his considerable wealth and military skill behind her cause. What followed was pure magic. Gilles fought beside Joan through some of the most important battles of the war. He was there when she lifted the siege of Orleans, he marched with her to Reims, and when Charles VII finally got his crown, Gilles de Rais stood right beside the throne as one of the most celebrated knights in France. At 24, he was everything medieval society admired, wealthy, brave, loyal, and blessed by God himself. The church even made him a Marshal of France, the highest military honor possible. Gilles de Rais was living the medieval dream. But dreams, especially medieval ones, have a nasty habit of turning into nightmares. Joan of Arc was captured by the English in 1430. A year later, she burned at the stake. Joan's death broke something fundamental in Gilles de Rais. The man who once charged into battle with religious fervor suddenly withdrew from public life, retreating to his sprawling estates like a wounded animal hiding in its den. What he did next would make any financial advisor weep. Gilles began spending money like the world was ending tomorrow. We're talking about theatrical productions that cost more than most kingdoms' annual budgets, complete with elaborate costumes, hired actors, and sets that would make Broadway jealous. He threw banquets that lasted for days, serving exotic foods to hundreds of guests who probably thought he'd lost his mind. But the real red flag? His sudden obsession with alchemy and the occult. Gilles started collecting books on black magic, hiring supposed sorcerers and alchemists who promised to help him transmute base metals into gold. Not because he needed money. Remember, this guy was still ridiculously wealthy, but because he was desperately searching for something to fill the void Joan's death had left behind. His servants began whispering about strange rituals conducted in the castle's lower chambers. Locals reported seeing mysterious lights and hearing unsettling sounds coming from his properties at night. The man who once fought for God was now apparently trying to make deals with the devil, and then children started disappearing. At first, it was just one or two from the villages near his estates. Poor families would send their kids to work at the castle, hoping for steady wages and maybe a chance at a better life. But these children never came home. When worried parents asked questions, Gilles' servants would give vague answers about the kids being sent elsewhere or given better opportunities. The local authorities, intimidated by Gilles' wealth and status, looked the other way. After all, who was going to challenge one of France's most celebrated war heroes over a few missing peasant children? But the disappearances weren't random. They followed a pattern. Young boys, usually between 8 and 12, often with fair hair and delicate features. Children who reminded him of something, or someone, from his past. The hero of France had become a predator, and his hunting ground was getting bigger every day. The events that unfolded within the walls of Gilles de Rais' castles were horrific, far surpassing the darkest fiction. Gilles developed a sinister method for acquiring his victims. He dispatched his servants to nearby villages, presenting enticing offers of employment, education, or even a place in the castle's choir. Desperate parents, seeking better opportunities for their children, entrusted their sons to the Marshal of France without suspicion. Upon entering the castle, these children were plunged into a nightmare. What followed was a systematic pattern of abuse and torment. Gilles did not merely end their lives, he prolonged their suffering. Accounts from witnesses describe him meticulously preparing for these sessions, treating them with a chilling formality. He would compel the children to participate in mock religious ceremonies before subjecting them to prolonged periods of cruelty. An early documented instance illustrates his disturbing approach. 12-year-old Judin, a furrier's apprentice, was taken under false pretenses. When he vanished, his family was misled into believing he had found work elsewhere. In truth, Judin became one of the first victims in Gilles' grim history. Testimony from his own servants revealed a disturbing routine. Victims were initially treated well, given fine clothes and elaborate meals. They were then led to secluded chambers where Gilles would reveal his true intentions, deriving satisfaction from their fear. His servant, Etienne Corriot, known as Poitou, recounted how Gilles would restrain the children, preventing their cries from being heard, and then commit unspeakable acts. The methods used to end their lives varied, including decapitation, throat cutting, dismemberment, or fatal blows. A specific, short, double-edged sword, a braquemard, was kept for these purposes. In his confession, Gilles admitted to disturbing interactions with the deceased, including kissing the bodies and admiring the severed heads and limbs of those he considered prettier. He would dissect their bodies, sometimes while they were still alive, and reportedly found amusement in their final moments. His accomplices later stated that Gilles would sometimes retain the bodies for days, continuing his macabre rituals. The castle's furnaces were frequently used to dispose of the remains, destroying evidence of his atrocities. Conservative estimates place the number of his victims at around 80 children, while more extensive calculations suggest it could have exceeded 200. This reign of terror spanned nearly a decade, with Gilles's actions becoming increasingly depraved over time. Most unsettling was Gilles's claim that these acts were part of occult practices. He believed the blood of innocent children held power for his alchemical experiments and could summon entities to restore his wealth and resurrect Joan of Arc. Medieval France thus witnessed the emergence of its first documented serial killer, who operated under the guise of a war hero's reputation. The man who once fought for France's salvation became the systematic destroyer of its most vulnerable, one child at a time. By 1440, Gilles de Rais had made a fatal mistake. He'd run out of money and started pissing off the wrong people. His decade-long spending spree had drained even his massive fortune. Desperate to maintain his lifestyle, Gilles began selling off family lands and borrowing heavily from the church. When creditors came calling, he responded the only way he knew how, with violence. He kidnapped a priest who was trying to collect on church property, holding him for ransom in direct defiance of ecclesiastical law. That was the last straw. The church and local nobles, who had been quietly tolerating the whispers about missing children, suddenly had a legal excuse to bring down France's most inconvenient war hero. The trial that followed in 1440 was a medieval media circus. Gilles faced charges in both ecclesiastical and civil courts: heresy, sodomy, and murder. The prosecution presented a parade of witnesses that included his own servants, local parents, and even some children who had somehow escaped his castle. But here's where things get interesting. Some modern historians argue that Gilles de Rais was the victim of the ultimate medieval setup. Think about it, he was massively wealthy, politically connected, and had dirt on half the French nobility from his military campaigns. His creditors included powerful bishops and nobles who stood to inherit his lands if he were convicted. The timing of his arrest, right when his debts were mounting, seems suspiciously convenient. The confession that sealed his fate came only after he was threatened with torture and excommunication. Medieval justice wasn't exactly known for its constitutional protections, and getting a confession out of someone facing eternal damnation wasn't particularly difficult. Yet the evidence against him was overwhelming. Over 100 witnesses testified about the disappearances. His own servants provided detailed accounts of the murders, describing specific victims and methods. The sheer volume of testimony from independent sources makes a complete conspiracy almost impossible to orchestrate. Gilles himself seemed to embrace his guilt with disturbing enthusiasm. During his confession, he provided graphic details about his crimes that weren't necessary for legal proceedings. He described his methods, his motivations, even his feelings during the murders. Either he was genuinely confessing to horrific crimes, or he was the most convincing liar in medieval history. The court found him guilty on all counts. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was hanged and then burned at the stake in Nantes, in front of a crowd that included many of the families whose children he had murdered. His last words were reportedly a prayer for forgiveness and a warning to other young nobles about the dangers of excess and vice. Whether this was genuine remorse or final performance art, We'll never know. What we do know is that medieval France had just executed either its most notorious serial killer or its most spectacular scapegoat. The truth, like most things in medieval history, died with the man himself. Death should have been the end of Gilles de Rais. Instead, it was just the beginning of his most twisted transformation yet. For centuries after his execution, French authorities tried to erase him from history entirely. His name was scrubbed from official records about Joan of Arc's campaigns. Historians writing about the 100 Years' War conveniently forgot to mention one of its most decorated commanders. The church, embarrassed by how long they'd ignored the disappearances, pretended he'd never existed. But you can't kill a story that good. Gilles de Rais was too perfect a villain to stay buried. By the 17th century, French storytellers had begun weaving his crimes into folktales. The wealthy nobleman who murdered children in his castle became the inspiration for Charles Perrault's Bluebeard, the fairy tale about a rich man who kills his wives and hides their bodies in a locked room. The details were sanitized for children's stories, but the core remained: power plus secrecy equals horror. The psychological profile of Gilles de Rais became a template for fictional monsters that still haunts us today: a charismatic leader hiding unspeakable darkness, a respected member of society who preys on the vulnerable, a man who uses wealth and status to enable his crimes. Sound familiar? That's because every compelling villain since has borrowed something from the Gilles de Rais playbook. Modern criminologists studying serial killers consistently point to Gilles as one of history's first documented cases of organized ritualistic murder. His methods, the careful victim selection, the escalating violence, the psychological manipulation, read like a textbook on criminal psychology written 600 years before the field existed. What makes his legacy particularly disturbing is how it reflects the dark side of medieval heroism. The same traits that made him a great knight, ruthlessness, lack of empathy, absolute belief in his own superiority, also made him a perfect predator. Medieval society created the perfect conditions for his crimes by celebrating violence and giving unlimited power to men who proved they could use it. The most chilling aspect of Gilles de Rais isn't that he was a monster, it's that he was a monster who fit perfectly into a society until the day he didn't. His transformation from hero to villain wasn't a dramatic shift, but a gradual slide that nobody wanted to notice until it was too late. Today, his story serves as a reminder that the line between civilization and savagery isn't as thick as we'd like to believe. Every culture has its Gilles de Rais, respected figures whose dark secrets are protected by power, wealth, and willful ignorance. The man who once stood beside Joan of Arc had become something far more enduring than any saint, a permanent warning about what happens when society gives unlimited power to people who were never meant to have it. Gilles de Rais proved that in the Middle Ages, you could die as a hero and be reborn as the boogeyman. The scariest part isn't that he was a monster, it's that he was a monster who looked exactly like a saint until the moment he didn't. A reminder that the most dangerous predators aren't the obvious ones lurking in dark alleys. They're the ones standing right beside the throne, wearing medals and earning applause. Whether Gilles de Rais was history's first serial killer or just the victim of medieval politics, his story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about power, justice, and the thin line between heroism and horror.